middle school history students. Today we are going to be continuing on in Chapter 9. We're going to be finishing it up with Section 3, American Culture. I really love when we get to do a chapter like this where there's not any wars happening, nobody's killing anybody else. There are no court cases or, it's just a chapter on some cool things that are happening in American culture during this time period. It's kind of a nice break from, all that other stuff we have to talk about so often in history classes. We're going to talk about a little bit about some of the art that came out of this time period. American literature and American art during this time period is really coming into its own. Prior to this, there were American artists, writers, painters, sculptors, composers, but it was during this time period that America, as a producer of art, began being recognized around the world. And so we're going to talk just a little bit about some of those people that made that happen. One of the first ones we're going to talk about is Washington Irving. Now, if Washington Irving sounds familiar to you, it is because we read Rip Van Winkle, one of his stories, earlier in this school year in our literature class. Washington Irving was born in 1783, and he was named after George Washington. That's where he got his name, which is kind of cool and sort of underscores how important everyday Americans thought George Washington was to their country. Washington Irving's works were set in American history. They talked about American history through the lens of satire. Satire is a humorous form of writing that kind of pokes fun at people in power or social norms. Satire can be just funny, it can be biting. Lots of great satirists throughout history, and Washington Irving was one of them. In Rip Van Winkle, of course, you remember the guy falls asleep before the American Revolution and wakes up 20 years later and doesn't understand what's going on. Another very well-known tale of his was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You could probably look this up. There's a Disney cartoon. It's not a very long one. Both of these stories, they're short stories, were published in a collection of stories in 1819 to 1820. I actually have it here in my library if you ever want to borrow it. But Washington Irving was one of the first American authors to be recognized internationally, recognized around the world. Washington Irving was influenced by great European writers, and his work sort of acted as a bridge between the European literary tradition and this new American literary tradition that we're trying to forge as a country. He focused on American themes and American values and created sort of this entirely new kind of writing. This gave birth to a whole writing style and a voice that was uniquely American. Another one of these writers, one of the most important writers of this time period, was a man named James Fenimore Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper was born in 1789. He was born into a very wealthy family, and he had grown up hearing stories about things that were happening in the West and on the frontier, and he was fascinated by those stories, and that became the focus of a lot of his work, some of his best-known works. He wasn't famous at first. His first novel, pretty forgettable. His second novel was called The Spy, and it was a big success. It was an adventure set during the American Revolution. In 1823, he published a book called The Pioneers, which was the first in a series of 5 novels about a character named Natty Bumppo, who was very sort of beloved character in American literature. And one of the things that James Fenimore Cooper did was he took actual historical events and used them as the setting for fictional novels. For example, his novel The Last of the Mohicans, which you may have heard of, it was a movie, goodness, back when I was in college, so it's been ages ago, but you could rent it and watch it now with your parents' permission, of course. But The Last of the Mohicans was set during the French and Indian War. The Mohicans were a made-up Indian Native American tribe, but he did a lot of research and made it as historically accurate as he could. So by placing these fictional characters into real historical settings, Cooper created, maybe not created, but he definitely popularized a genre we call now historical fiction, and he did it very, very well. There were critics, of course, he had. A lot of his critics criticized the women in his stories as being kind of flat characters without too much interest, but he was very popular. His books sold a lot. There was another author during this time period named Catherine Maria Sedgwick who wrote about heroic female characters. It's interesting to me that her writings are not as famous as Cooper's, but she wrote A New England Tale and Hope Leslie and some other books like that. And so we've got a new American style of writing coming up on the scene. And we've got some art that's coming up on the scene as well. And I know that I have a lot of you in this class who are artists yourself. You love to create beautiful things. And I want to introduce you, I'm really excited to introduce you to a couple of artists. Now, I have already put on my Facebook page a short documentary about Thomas Cole, and we'll get to him in a minute, but you'll be able to see some of his really gorgeous artwork. But let's talk about the Hudson River School. So when you've got writing like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, this inspires other artists. And these artists began to paint American landscapes. Earlier American painters mainly painted portraits. We didn't have a lot of American landscapes. But in the 1830s, something called the Hudson River School emerged. And the Hudson River School was kind of dedicated to creating paintings that reflected the beauty of the American landscape. And it's really astonishing to me that painters hadn't really stopped to paint landscapes prior to this, because America's got a rich variety of landscapes. And of course, later on we're going to discover, we've got these vast deserts, and the prairie has its own beauty, and the Rocky Mountains, and the Pacific Northwest, and of course the Mississippi Delta. We've got all of these different kinds of landscapes. And it's during this time period that the artists of the Hudson River School really began to focus on American landscapes. Now, this was a group of artists. They took their name from the Hudson River Valley, which was a very popular subject in many of their paintings. One of the most important painters of the Hudson River School was Thomas Cole. In fact, he was one of its founders. And Thomas Cole was actually an Englishman. He had moved to the U.S. from Britain in 1819 and really kind of fell in love with the American landscape. He gained fame as an artist. Just stop a second and look in your book on page 310 and 311, and you'll see one of his landscape paintings called the Oxbow. It's just a gorgeous painting and very realistic. These artists were interested in painting realistic pictures of American landscape. He encouraged other American artists to paint the land, to paint what they saw. In fact, one of the things that he said is, to walk with nature as a poet is the necessary condition of a perfect artist. He really believed that artists should immerse themselves in what they see outside so that they can create that beauty. But by the 1840s, some of that realism started to change, and just the focus on just landscapes started to change. And people began including portraits of kind of daily lives, scenes from daily lives. One of the most famous of the later Hudson River School artists was George Caleb Bingham. And Bingham and another one, Alfred Jacob Miller, traveled west to paint scenes of Americans just living their lives. One of George Caleb Bingham's most famous paintings is one called Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. I highly encourage you to look that up. We don't actually have that in our book. I wish we did, and if you were in my classroom, I would have it up on the smartboard as a picture. I want to also talk about, go back to page 309 in your book and take a look. There's a picture of a bird, and it is 1827 when John Audubon begins publishing a series of artwork called Birds of America. And there's even a society today, an environmental society called the Audubon Society, that's interested in preserving nature and caring for specifically birds, but all animals as well. And John Audubon did very realistic and gorgeous paintings of American birds. And so he's also very important, although he's not going to be on our test. Another thing that we want to talk about when we're talking about American culture is religion. You really cannot separate American history from religious history, because it was one of the main motivations of many people that came to the U.S. was the motivation of seeking religious freedom. And so we've got a really strong religious history here in the U.S. Through the mid-1800s, there were several waves of religious revivalism, and we're going to talk about some of those in later chapters. But there were these periods of revivalisms where meetings would be held. The meetings were called revivals. They were called revivals, and I have a specific definition for revivals here on the board that's not in your book. An emotional meeting designed to awaken religious faith through impassioned preaching and prayer. These meetings would sometimes last for days, and they would include not just preaching and prayer, but sing-alongs, large blocks of time just dedicated to singing. One of the kinds of songs that they sang at these meetings was the spiritual. And spirituals are a type of folk hymn. They're found in white and African American history, in their folk music and religious traditions. Many of the ones that we think of when we think of spirituals today have their roots in the African American slave culture, and some of them are a lot of them are really focused on heaven. You can imagine if you were a slave, you would be focused on the life after this one too. But one you might know is "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." Is one of the most popular ones, and you could look up American spirituals and find some really good renditions of some amazing music in that tradition. I really encourage you to do that. Spirituals reflected the religious nature of some Americans. There was also popular folk music. People would sing in bars or in parties, get-togethers, that kind of thing. The American music was really starting to develop during this time period. Another thing that we want to talk about is architecture and education. Architecture in America for a long time was just sort of following whatever style was used in Great Britain. During the American Revolution, architects like Thomas Jefferson really borrowed a lot from the Greek and Roman traditions. They decided they didn't want to follow whatever it was that Great Britain was doing. They wanted to follow some far more ancient ideas. They admired Greece and Rome for their democratic and republican ideals, and so they wanted to kind of reflect that in their architecture. And you can see a lot of the buildings in Washington D.C. In fact, when we get to go next year, you'll see in real life a lot of Greek and Roman influence in many of the buildings in Washington D.C. More and more architects ended up following Jefferson's ideas. Whatever else you might say about Jefferson, he was an excellent architect. And these buildings that they built were usually made of marble or some other kind of stone that wore really well. And they were built to last. Thinking about the White House, thinking about the Capitol building, thinking about Jefferson's own home, really gorgeous buildings. You might consider a word they're often used to describe them as stately. They're very dignified and solid buildings. Another thing that began during this time period is the idea of education. There were several famous, important early American political leaders who had this belief that democracy could only succeed if the people living in it were educated and enlightened people. There wasn't, though, an agreement about how that sort of general education should be given out. And for a long time, families were just responsible for the education of their own children. There was no public school. Only wealthy people got to go to school, generally speaking. But eventually, there's this idea comes up of a state-funded public school, and it begins to gather support. And in 1837, Massachusetts lawmakers created a state board of education, and other states followed example. And from there, the idea of public school grew. And we'll talk more about public school in later chapters. But for now, that ends chapter 9 for us. The next video will start chapter 10. And we will be talking about the era of Andrew Jackson. So stay tuned for that.